Hi, and welcome to third grade Michigan History Week here at the museum at our first Fires program. My name is Pat, and at this station today we're going to be talking about some of the different technology changes that Native Americans saw with the arrival of the fur traders to Michigan. So I've got a bunch of stuff laid out in front of me with some different tech that the Native Americans might have received from these fur traders, and I want to go over some of it and how it changed Native Americans' lives. So the first thing that I want to start with is something that's really important, especially as we start entering fall and winter here, and that is having a fire. For Native Americans, fire was really important for keeping them warm, but it also allowed them to cook their food, it also helped them make their shelters, and it also helped them make their clothing. So fire was extremely important. So take a guess really quick how you think Native Americans might have made a fire prior to these Europeans coming. So what the Native Americans had available to them were things like sticks, right? They didn't have a lot of metal like you might think to, hit metal and flint to make sparks or rocks together. That's not really things they could find in this area here. So what they would find is a piece of wood like this. They would drill out a little hole in there, and they'd find a relatively pretty straight stick. And the way this works is through a friction method. So you'd put the stick in that hole that you had carved out, and you'd have some dried grass or dried leaves in front of it. And you'd basically start with your hands at the top, and you would go back and forth with your hands. And you could probably hear that squeaking. That's the sound of friction. That's the sound of these two pieces of wood rubbing together. And what's going to happen over time as I do this and spin it is it's going to get really hot down here where these pieces of wood are rubbing. And eventually I'm going to get a tiny little ember, like a little spark. And what the Native Americans could then do is tip this little ember into that dry grass and leaves they had. They would take it up, they would blow into it, and you could get your flames started. And you could start your fire from that. Now when these European fur traders arrived, they had a different technology that made it a little bit easier to start fires. So they had steel strikers and they had pieces of flint. So if I come forward here, when I strike my flint on my steel striker, I'm going to get some sparks. So hopefully you can see that. And those sparks could do the same thing as that little ember did, where you could catch it into your dried grass and dried leaves and get a fire going. And so if you're a Native American and you see these fur traders come to your village and show you how this works, it's going to be something you're probably going to want, because this is going to be a lot quicker and a lot easier than the pieces of wood are. And this takes no setup, right? You just have the two materials you need. With this, you have to do a little work to carve out the wood to make it just right. So what I want to try now is showing you a little demonstration of how to start a fire with flint and steel, and hopefully I can get one going here really quickly. Alright, so what we have set up here is some jute twine that we've kind of taken apart to make a little nest, and we've got some steel wool inside there. That's just to make it go a little quicker for us here. For the Native Americans or the fur traders, though, they would use dried grass, dried leaves, and they would form into a shape like this so you could catch the sparks from your flint and steel you created to give you a better chance of starting your fire. Now once the fire was started, you'd quickly add it to more leaves and then eventually to twigs, and you could have a larger fire begin. Now the trick is to find a nice sharp edge on a piece of flint and then hit it at an angle on this steel striker, and it's basically going to scrape off the metal and create a red hot spark of metal that's going to land on here, and hopefully if we get it in the right spot, we should start a fire in no time at all. So let's see. Oh, so close. So you can see I was trying to blow on it just to help spread our flames, give them a little more oxygen. Fortunately, our fire did not start. There we go. So you can see why this might be a slightly better method than using sticks to start a fire. That took us a few seconds there. It wasn't too bad to do. Alright, so fire starting was one really great improvement that the Native Americans had once the Europeans arrived with that flint and steel, but there's plenty of other new technologies that made life a lot easier. So the next one I want to talk about is containers and pots the Native Americans had for storage and cooking their food. So prior to the fur traders arriving, they had pots and containers that are made out of things like bark, like this birch bark container here. And birch bark was really great for the Native Americans because it is waterproof, so I could put, liquid in here and it's not going to soak through the wood or spill out of it. However, if I'm trying to cook something like a stew or a soup, if I put this near my flames, my basket's going to go up, my pot's going to go up, and it's not going to be good. I'm going to lose my meal. So these containers work, but they weren't great for cooking. The other option Native Americans had was clay pots, like this one here. And you can see this one's got some decorations in it, so it's really neat, it's really artistic, it looks great. However, once again, similar kind of thing. If I put this directly over the heat of my flames, it's going to dry the clay out, it's going to crack it, and it's going to break it apart, and I'm going to lose my dinner. So you could cook with this, you just had to put it kind of near your fire, but not directly by it. But it's going to take so much longer to do it that way because you're not getting as much heat. So clay pots like this did work, however, they weren't the most effective. Now the Native Americans did figure out a way to make it work slightly better, and that is taking hot stones that they could then add to these clay pots to get it to boil quicker than you would just by setting it near the fire. However, when the fur traders and Europeans came, metal pots like this made it so much easier because it didn't take any work. You could just hang this directly over your fire, put your liquid in here, and you didn't have to worry about it catching on fire or drying up and breaking apart. But I do want to show you how Native Americans cooked with clay pots like this using the hot stones. So we're going to go to my other table and I'm going to show you how this method worked. So what we've got set up here is I've got some rocks that are on a burner. So this is like rocks that you would have around your fire if you're the Native American. And I'm going to use some tongs to add them to my clay pot that has water in it. Now for the Native Americans, they didn't have metal tongs like this. They would have to use animal skins, kind of like oven mitts, or they could use things like sticks, kind of like chopsticks, where they'd pick up the rocks and put them in their containers in that way. But you can see when I pick up one of these hot rocks and I add it to the water, you can probably hear that little sizzle. The heat from my rocks is being transferred to the water in my container, and it's going to slowly heat it up over time. Now the trick is, after I put a rock in, I have to take that rock back out to let it dry off. Alright, so we already added the one stone. We've zoomed in so you can see a little better result here. I'm going to start adding some more stones to it. You can hear that sizzling sound, so we're heating up the water. You can see some of the little bubbles forming there. Here's where we run into a problem, right? I don't have a lot of room anymore, so just like the Native Americans would have to do, I'd have to take my rocks out and add new hot ones in there because these ones kind of basically already gave off all their heat to the water. So I have to do this pretty quickly or else my water is going to start to cool down, which obviously we don't want if we're trying to make our food. So you can see why, this method would work, however, it is not really the best, and why you might want a metal pot that you can just put right over your fire and not have to worry about. We'll see if we can get this to a complete boil, though. We're really close. Well, maybe 2 more rocks will do it. And I'll do 1 more. And there you go. You can see all the bubbles coming up. We've actually reached boiling point for this water. So if we put our meat in there, we put our corn in there, we could start to cook that and make a really nice dish to eat. Alright, so the next technology that we're going to talk about is going to be in clothing. Now you might not really think about technology in clothing a lot, but there is a lot of technology that goes into clothing. Now for the Native Americans, the original clothing they had was made from animal skins. So this here is a piece of deer hide that's been turned into leather. And you could cut and sew this into your shoes, your pants, shirts, all kinds of different things. However, it took a lot of work to turn a deer skin into leather like this. So first of all, you had to hunt the deer. You had to bring it back to your village, then you had to cut the skin off. You'd use a small stone tool called a scraper to clean off all the muscles and gunk and fat that would be left on the skin. Then there was a process of stretching it and drying it that you would go through. You would also take this hide and you would soak it in a bowl like this with water and the brain of that deer that you would kill. This is why it's called brain tanning. And you would let it soak in there. And what that would do would be make this leather turn really soft and flexible like this. If you didn't do that, it'd be really hard and rigid and stiff, which is not good for your clothing. After that, you'd once again stretch it out and dry it some more. Eventually, you need to smoke it. You need to put it under a really smoky fire, not near the flames so much, but up high so all the smoke would penetrate the leather and it would seal the pores in it so that it didn't get ruined if it got wet. And then you could finally turn it into your clothing. And that was a long, long process that took lots of work. So when the European fur traders came and they brought things with them like wool or linen like this that was already made and all you had to do was just sew it together to make your clothing, for the Native Americans, this was a new technology. This was a new thing they really wanted that would make their life a lot easier. You think about how long it takes to make a piece of leather in the way I just described versus trading an animal hide, getting a piece like this, and being able to sew it together into that outfit. It's going to save you a lot of time and energy. So clothing was really, really important during the fur trade. It was also really lightweight, easy to fold into the shapes that you needed. And so for the fur traders, it was easy to bring this along with them to trade. So that's another example of a great upgrade in technology. The last one I think I'll talk about today is going to be in hunting. So for the Native Americans, when they were doing their hunting, they were using stone tools like this. So this is a stone arrowhead, and this is made from a rock called chert. And to make an arrowhead like this, it was quite the process. You had to take things like antler or bone. You'd take heavier stones too, and you would start to smash it into there and chip and break away the pieces until you had roughly formed it into the shape and size that you wanted it to be. Now, it's not a perfect science of doing this. The Native Americans were pretty skilled at it. They had lots of practice, but even still, it might take you 10 or 15 tries to make an arrowhead that you could end up using for hunting, because if it's not just right, it's not going to fly straight when you shoot it with your bow and arrow. So this was a really long process. Now, that's just the arrowhead. You'd also have to make the arrow out of a nice straight piece of wood. You'd have to make your bow out of a piece of wood that was long and bendable and flexible. You'd have to make your bowstring, which they made from animal tendons. So once again, it was a lot of work to make a bow and arrow. And these bows and arrows would work for hunting for the Native Americans, but they were more of a close range weapon. So you could maybe, 50, 60 yards away, you could hit a deer with an arrow like this. And you'd have to hit it in the right spot, or else you'd have to chase after that deer for a while and maybe even shoot it again. So when the fur traders came along and they brought with them muskets like this musket is a lot more powerful than that bow and arrow would be, and it can also shoot a lot further as well. And so for the Native Americans, once they saw how to use these muskets, they really wanted them for hunting because it made their lives much easier. Now, the trick with the musket, though, is that this technology costs a lot of resources. So you need the gunpowder. You need the musket balls with this. You need to be able to carry your gunpowder and be able to carry your musket balls and to keep them dry. You're going to need to find pieces of flint that can be used for your gun, like the piece we have here. And of course, you also need the gun. Now, the way these worked is you would first of all take some gunpowder, you'd pour it down the barrel of your gun here, and you would put your musket ball in there, and then you kind of wad it up in a piece of paper. Then you took this ramrod here, and you would have to push everything down to the bottom of it. Once you had done that, you had to replace this little ramrod. You'd go over to the side of your gun here. You'd pull this trigger back halfway. You'd pour more of your gunpowder in this little pan here. You would then close that up, and you could walk around with your gun like this. So you can't actually fire the gun right now. You have to pull this trigger back all the way when you want to fire it. Now, this is called a flintlock because there's a piece of flint here. And when you'd fired it, so I'll pull the trigger all the way back, you'd squeeze the trigger and this flint would strike the metal here, and as we've already seen, that's going to create sparks. And those sparks would ignite the gunpowder in the pan, which would ignite the gunpowder in the bottom of this barrel, and that would shoot your musket ball out of the end. Now, I don't have a good piece of gun flint here, so what's going to happen when I fire this is my flint's probably going to fall out, which if you're hunting is not a good thing. It's not quick and easy to repair. So this is why trading for the right materials was really important. But I'll still show you how this works because it will fire for one shot. So if you watch right here, when I pull the trigger, we should get some sparks where my flint strikes my metal. So, and there you go. So that would then shoot my musket for me, and it could make hunting for me, like I said, a lot easier. So this was a technology that the Native Americans wanted to get from the Europeans as well. So hopefully you can see how some of these new technologies that the European fur traders brought along might be important and useful for the Native Americans. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and we'll be willing to answer them.